This is admittedly a weird one. While these two don't have much in common, they both have somewhat of a God complex and often look down on their opponents, making themselves out to be the second coming of Christ in comparison, which leads to them lashing out in rage. But they are also known for their unique and ludicrously specific hacks, so much so that plenty of people out there believe that these two could take down entire verses much stronger than themselves with their abilities alone. I'm gonna go on to run down their stats for you, even though I don't think it'll play too much of a part in this fight, if I'm being honest. I'll be using all the information we have on Gojo from the most recent chapter, that being 237 by the time of writing, so some manga spoilers ahead. You've been warned. I will also not be equating energy, as the latter parts of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure don't exactly have a power system like Cursed Energy, Reiatsu, or Chakra, but more so just have stands. However, even apart from that, characters within Jujutsu Kaisen like Maki or Toji also use their lack of cursed energy to their own benefit and as a legitimate strategy against their opponents who use cursed energy, so it isn't exactly unfair either. But without wasting any more time, let's start off the discussion by going over Gojo's capabilities. Many words can be used to describe Satoru Gojo, some of anger or annoyance, others of admiration, but two words in particular are what instantly resonate in the hearts and minds of both his enemies as well as his allies: the strongest. Remaining utterly unrivaled at the pinnacle of the verse, Gojo towers over the rest of Jujutsu society, both sorcerer and curses alike. This inherently places him above feats from characters like Jogo, who can destroy a good portion of Shibuya without even using his strongest attack. The same is true for a weaker 15-finger Sukuna than the 20-finger one Gojo just got done fighting with in the manga, turning Shibuya into a barren wasteland using his domain expansion, Malevolent Shrine. These two showings, as well as others from more prominent fighters throughout the series, are usually calced at the force needed to destroy most towns or cities, but this isn't exactly the strongest attack potency meta Jujutsu Kaisen has to offer, with disaster curses like Dagon alongside Jogo once again being shown to create things like mountains or islands with their domain expansions. Domain expansions being barrier techniques spawned from the cursed energy of their users, and sorcerers are capable of reinforcing both their attacks and their bodies with cursed energy, as demonstrated by characters like Yuta, who admits he's actually on the weaker side, but he uses his immense cursed energy reserves to amplify his attacks and durability. This would mean Gojo should theoretically be capable of outputting mountain levels of force at the bare minimum, or potentially much higher if you consider how much stronger he is than these disaster curses, or even the reanimated Toji that completely demolished Dagon. There are also even stronger interpretations, such as Yuki's black hole that Kinjaku, potentially the smartest character in the series, claims could have destroyed or dragged the whole world, or the infamous volume cover statement saying Sukuna could destroy the world as we know it. To me personally, these are more so out there since how exactly Gojo scales to Yuki's black hole is somewhat debatable, and the as we know it portion of the Sukuna volume cover statement makes it sound more like a society one would know or be familiar with as opposed to the entire planet, with the terms world and society being synonymous as well. That being said, Gojo being able to output mountain levels of force isn't far-fetched considering just how much stronger he is than the disaster curses, especially if you compare their domains. Jujutsu Kaisen also has varying metas of speed depending on who you ask or what showings you feel are the most consistent. Sub to supersonic speeds are already a pretty solid foundation, as characters like Maki can grab and react to bullets even at the earliest parts of the story, with characters like Kinjaku or even Geto who can blitz Maki capable of reacting to bullets as well. There's also the widely known statement of Cursed Naoya's speed reaching Mach 3, or what's usually considered to be the higher ends of supersonic speeds. Gojo once again massively outscales these showings, with both Geto and Kinjaku conceding inferiority to him on numerous occasions, but there is no concrete way to say he'd be above them in the ranges of hypersonic without using something like Kashimo's lightning. But Hikari struggles to react to it, and no one else does, making it somewhat difficult to get any real scaling out of it. This may change during Kashimo's current fight with Sukuna, but for now, there is also the idea that Gojo's hollow purple technique, which combines both his red and blue, moves at light speed since it is described as an imaginary mass rushing forth, correlating somewhat with the description of tachyons, a hypothetical particle that will always travel faster than light. But the existence of these particles is merely a hypothesis, perhaps mostly prominently proposed by American physicist Gerald Feinberg in his 1967 paper Possibility of Faster Than Light Particles. Still remaining a hypothesis to this day, there's no reference to tachyon particles or anything relating to this theory in the entirety of the manga, alongside its usage of the phrase imaginary mass being somewhat questionable as well, as others have noted that that it more so translates to virtual mass from the raw scans of the manga, which is an entirely different concept. But more importantly, and where things begin to get interesting, are Gojo's abilities. As the first of the Gojo clan to inherit both the Six Eyes as well as the limitless curse technique in several hundreds of years, Gojo has immaculate sensing capabilities and control over his cursed energy reserves, having practically an infinite amount of it. The Six Eyes also allows its users better control of the limitless curse technique. Infinity is the neutral base state of limitless, and it makes Gojo essentially untouchable by wrapping his body in something akin to an invisible barrier. To those attacking Gojo, it may seem as though they've stopped completely, but this isn't entirely the case. To try to keep things as simple as possible, let's say that someone wanted to punch Gojo at point A while they themselves are at point C. Their fist would then have to cross this distance between the two and point B, but what Infinity does is exaggerate the space between the two infinitely to the point where their fist would never reach Gojo. Infinity is the greatest point of contention for most versus battles that include Gojo, especially when discussing whether or not Infinity is passively always active. Before his fight with Toji, Infinity has to be manually activated, catching Gojo while he was off guard and after he's released Infinity being the crux of Toji's plan. But a year or so after this, Gojo as a teenager has mastered both the Limitless Curse Technique and Reverse Curse Technique to the point where both are working around the clock at all times, making Infinity passive. He also has other abilities derived from the Limitless, like Blue, which is essentially the power to attract, creating a giant magnet or vacuum similar to the Chibaku Tensei from Naruto. But Gojo still has even more abilities through accessing Reverse Curse Technique. Curses and cursed energy are spawned from negative emotions and energy, but they're using Reverse Curse Technique, that negative energy is multiplied, then reverted into positive energy. And with that energy, Gojo gains both an incredible healing factor and Curse Technique reversal, Red. With Blue being the power to attract, Red being the opposite is the power to repel. And as I mentioned earlier, combining both Red and Blue creates Hollow Purple, an imaginary mass that destroys any and all that stands in its path. Last but certainly not least, Gojo has also achieved the pinnacle of all Jujutsu sorcery through his domain expansion, Unlimited Void. Domain expansions come with guaranteed hits upon their activation, and Gojo's is especially noteworthy, as it works on what domains would usually register as inanimate objects or people and things that don't have cursed energy, meaning that Gojo's domain works even without using energy equation. To get into what his domain's ability specifically does, however, Unlimited Void brings its target into the Limitless Curse Technique to feed them both endless amounts of stimuli and information to the point where they cannot move or act. For example, if the domain's target were to see or think of an apple, their minds would first have to process the letter A in the word apple infinitely. All information and actions you could possibly take in your life are forced upon you endlessly while you slowly die. That about wraps it up for all of Gojo's abilities relevant to this fight, and we can now move on to his opponent. Unlike his opponent, Haruno Shiobana was born with nothing to his name, but after saving the life of a powerful member of the Italian mob, Haruno's life would take a sudden turn, abandoning Haruno Shiobana and becoming Giorno Giovanna, teenage mafioso with a dream, a desire to liberate the innocent youth of Italy from evil being pushed on them in the form of drugs. A powerful narrative to be sure, one of someone who was born into nothing with the desire to reach new heights purely in order to help those who cannot help themselves. And throughout this journey, Giorno Giovanna would defeat a plethora of opponents that he would encounter with his stand, or the manifestation of his fighting spirit, Gold Experience. Though Gold Experience's main selling point isn't exactly its physical strength, it should still compare to showings from characters like Sekko, who creates craters in the ground by jumping from a helicopter with the force equivalent to 30 pounds worth of TNT, usually what's enough to destroy buildings. Or characters like Vladimir Kolkaki from Shameless Purple Haze, who uses his stand Rainy Day Dream Away to create a rainstorm over Tormani, Sicily, requiring about 61 kilotons or town levels of force. Giorno also compares pretty prominently to characters from Part 3, Stardust Crusaders, with the evolution of his stand, Gold Experience Requiem, stated to be the strongest stand ability. While some believe this means every single stand from every single part, I believe this more so refers to stands featured in Part 5, Bento Areo. Otherwise, you would have to concede that Star Platinum in Part 6 is then stronger than Gold Experience Requiem, since similar statements are made about Star Platinum later on in Part 6. Regardless, Polnareff's stand Silver Chariot that is pretty comparable to Star Platinum is featured in Part 5, and despite Polnareff's current condition, Diavolo says he hasn't gotten any weaker since their previous encounter. This would then grant Giorno access to other showings within the building or town ranges, like Dark Blue Moon's creation of a whirlpool, or Avdol melting a hole into the ground with Magician's Red, which comes out at force equivalent to 920 pounds of TNT, or building level. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure having building levels of attack potency has been pretty consistent for the most part, with city block to town feats like Star Platinum breathing in with enough force to suck in all of justice, a stand that can cover an entire town big enough to hold 1,000 people, or Vladimir Kokaki's aforementioned Rainstorm being somewhat on the more contentious side of things. There are ways to get Giorno with Requiem even higher, like using the calcs of Weather Report's heavy weather stated to be capable of destroying the ozone layer with force equivalent to that of an island, then arguing that Requiem should outscale this by being stronger than Silver Chariot, who is somewhat comparable to Star Platinum, stated to be the strongest stand ability in Part 6. This could potentially fall apart, however, if you consider the fact that Star Platinum gets stronger over the course of Part 3 after fighting Chariot, and how Silver Chariot would compare to Part 6 Star Platinum is somewhat debatable, and therefore I will be proceeding with the conclusion that Giorno should be capable of building levels of force with gold experience, and potentially upwards into the town ranges with Requiem. Moving on now to briefly cover Giorno's speed, there are several sub to supersonic showings that Giorno compares to, like the Sex Pistols being shown capable of intercepting bullets and catching them to save Mista, alongside Star Platinum catching one all the way back at the beginning of Part 3, being calced out to about Mach 2. Then there's JoJo's infamous Lightspeed meta, usually relying on showings from Part 2 with characters like Cars reacting to ultraviolet rays, Joseph reacting to sun rays from the Redstone of Aja, and Polnareff's fight with the Hanged Man. You could question how exactly base Giorno would scale to these Hamon-era characters, or you could make arguments like, if Polnareff could just react to the Hanged Man using reflections to move at the speed of light, he wouldn't have needed a coin to intercept him. But there are also statements from Part 6 that just outright state that Star Platinum has surpassed the speed of light, and Requiem should compare to this pretty comfortably by scaling off of Silver Chariot. I'd also like to quickly disprove the idea that Requiem has infinite speed from moving in Diavolo's Erased or Zero Time. I've talked about Diavolo's abilities in my video analyzing his character as a villain, which you can watch here, but to briefly summarize, Diavolo doesn't actually erase time in the literal sense. Let's say at point A I reach for this cup of water, but I have to cross point B to reach point C where the water is, which takes me 5 seconds to do so. Diavolo's King Crimson can skip those 5 seconds for everyone else, but Diavolo can still act and move within those 5 seconds. Essentially, time still exists, but only for Diavolo, and it's not completely erased, non-existent time. With that being said, Giorno with Requiem should be above the speed of light. As I briefly mentioned earlier, both Gold Experience and Requiem's main selling point isn't exactly raw strength, but more so their abilities. With base Gold Experience having the ability to give life, turning inanimate objects into small animals or plant life, as well as the ability to overstimulate human senses with its punches, causing opponents to perceive things in agonizing slow motion. Giorno can also use Gold Experience's life creation as a means to heal both himself and others, creating both limbs and organs. Where things truly get somewhat complicated is looking at the evolution of Gold Experience after Giorno pierces himself with the stand arrow, Gold Experience Requiem or GER. As explained in its only appearance, the strength of an attacker's will and actions will be reverted to 0. Those who are struck by this power will have even their deaths reverted to 0, and thus continuously die an infinite number of times. This is shown when GER can revert Diavolo's time skip and finishes him off. Giorno's abilities may seem simple enough on the surface, but we'll see where things could get messy as we move on into the matchup. The power of infinity versus the power of 0. To briefly recap their physical stats before we discuss how their abilities would interact with each other, Gojo is much stronger than Giorno at mountain levels of force, but Giorno in turn embarrasses Gojo with a horrific speed gap, being upwards into the ranges of light speeds, whereas Gojo's speed is a bit more questionable. I provided 3 different interpretations for how speed in Jujutsu Kaisen could work. If you think that Hollow Purple moves at the speed of light through the tachyon particles hypothesis, or if you think Gojo should be able to react to Kashima's lightning, then it becomes a bit closer. Otherwise, Gojo just scales massively above characters who can move up to supersonic speeds, which does him no favors here, and he more than likely will never be able to hit or perceive Giorno. That being said, however, Giorno will also never be able to hit Gojo, as he has no way around infinity. If you don't think that base Giorno scales to any of the lightspeed feats from Power Parts just yet, then it's pretty much a guarantee that he's getting destroyed by Gojo, as the massive gap in their attack potency and durability would just be too overwhelming, and Gojo can more easily heal from Giorno's attacks using reverse curse technique than Giorno can with base Gold Experience. Where things get a bit more tricky, however, is with Requiem, as any of Gojo's attacks will be reverted to 0, and he can't actually touch Giorno due to this, as well as the monstrous speed gap. But as I mentioned earlier, the same is true for Giorno. You could say that Giorno would just revert Gojo's attacks and will to 0, which is true for normal punches and things like red, blue, or purple, but something like Infinity's Barrier isn't really an attack or something that is aimed at Giorno, so it's debatable as to whether Giorno could return it to 0 or not. You could also argue that Giorno trying to return the Infinity Barrier barrier to 0 would just result in it infinitely exaggerating the distance between infinite and 0, just as it does when someone attempts to pierce it, and thus Giorno still has no way around it. Giorno reverting Gojo's will to 0 also may not really do anything, as the infinity barrier is completely passive and Gojo doesn't necessarily have to keep it up himself, and therefore even if his will to fight is 0, the infinity barrier still remains. You could also point out that we don't really know how Gojo reverts things to 0, and he may actually need to touch Gojo for it to occur, the same way Diavolo touched him, but I won't really go there since I'm trying to give both sides the benefit of the doubt. So now we're in a situation where neither side can touch the other. The only win con I can think of for either side is Gojo's domain expansion, Unlimited Void. Though most domain expansions in Jujutsu Kaisen don't work on those without cursed energy, Gojo's domain are one of the few that do, as demonstrated in his fight against the disaster curses, where opening his domain against them was a risk because of the non-sorcerer humans that were around at the time, meaning it'll work on Giorno, alongside the gap in speed being negated due to the guaranteed sure hit within the domain. If Gojo gets to expand his domain, then it's pretty much game over, as there's no way to really prove that Giorno could handle infinite information that would cause him to freeze and eventually kill him. And even if you argue that Gold Experience Requiem could handle this infinite information, Giorno himself still can't, and whatever affects Giorno affects Requiem as well. Once Giorno is frozen, Gojo can either leave him to die or hit him with any attack and one-shot him, as there is still the major power difference. You could argue that Requiem will revert Gojo expanding his domain to 0, but you could also argue against this by saying Gojo merely expanding his domain isn't exactly an attack on Giorno, and the guaranteed sure hit is more so. But by the time the sure hit lands, Giorno is already trapped in the infinite information, and thus this win con remains. But the idea that Requiem could return his domain to 0 is still possible, and thus for the first time making one of these videos, I can't exactly declare a winner here, and this may actually be a tie, with the battle between the power of infinity and the power of 0 becoming a matter of an unstoppable force versus an immovable object. But what do you think? Can Gold Experience Requiem revert Gojo expanding his domain to 0? Does the tachyon particle theory actually apply to purple and Gojo is light speed because Sukuna can react to it? Does Giorno actually compare to Heavy Weather's ozone destruction? As I said though, I don't think the physical capabilities of these two are all that important, as the main win cons are usually centered around if you think Gojo can get his domain sure hit off, or what you believe Giorno and Requiem could revert to 0. With that being said, I have other JoJo's Bizarre Adventure content on my channel you may be interested in, like my video analyzing Diavolo as a villain, since Vento Areo is my favorite part. But there's also my video dissecting Sukuna vs Akuma if you're more interested in the JJK side of things. I do plan to make more content related to both of these series in the future, so subscribe for free to be notified of all my future projects or when I upload or stream. Like this video to support the channel and myself, as well as let me know that this is the type of content you want to see. Thank you all for watching, and have a blessed day.